Hello, everyone. Welcome to this FAIN event. I'm Heather Morris, and I am delighted to be here this evening with the one and only, the incredible, the beautiful Christy Lefteri to talk about her new book. If you haven't seen it already, folks, you've got to go and find it. Christy, welcome. Thank you for this opportunity. And hey, how about you start telling us a little bit about the book that you've just released on the world?
Well, hi Heather, and hi everyone. And thank you for that lovely introduction. That was so lovely. Uh, I'll tell you a little bit about the story. It's about a family who live in an unnamed place in Greece. And this place has suffered from a wildfire that's got out of control. And an ancient forest has almost completely burnt down. And this family, the main character is called Irini, and she lives with her husband Dasso and her little daughter Hara. They continue to live inside this burnt ancient forest in Irini's father-in-law's house, in a house that's escaped the fire. And at the beginning of the story, Irini goes for a walk in this burnt forest to take her dog for a walk, and the dog veers off their usual path, and she follows the dog, and she finds in the forest the man who started the fire. So the story starts there, but Irini, she's so taken aback. She finds him there, half dead, half alive, and it forces her to face a lot of things. One of which is her memories of the fire, but she can't manage to allow herself to remember it properly. So she starts to write it down because it's too traumatic. It's a story about trauma. It's about family. It's about love. It's about learning to love again after trauma.
Yeah.
But it's also a story about where do we put the blame? A lot about
Yes.
distribution of blame. Very devastating circumstances in our times of climate crisis. Where does the blame go? That's basically it in a nutshell, probably a long nutshell.
All right. Well, we're going to nut it out a little bit more, folks. But can I just first say, oh, gosh, some time ago, I read a short article, and it was about the great openings in literature, that first line or first sentence in literature. And somebody had gone over and gone back sort of decades and had given their version of the best opening lines. And I think he gave the number one to the book about Mars, about they made it into that movie with Matt Damon. However, I feel your opening line is now going to get put with the great opening lines of literature. First three words, folks, and you're hooked. It's as simple as that. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for giving readers that beginning, which then will take them into this incredible story.
Well, that is a compliment, Heather. Thank you. What a compliment to hear on a Monday morning.
Oh, yeah, look, I try and find a great opening line, and I've never managed to nail it. You nailed it brilliantly, so I think credit where credit's due.
Thank
But
you. And
you're right.
Lines of literature and things like that, I think it really sort of gets me thinking. So that's a real compliment. Thank you very much.
And well deserved and earned. And you brought up the topic, the subject matter behind the story, which of course is climate change. And I think we can really nut that out a bit. I just think that for today, for me, it's quite fortuitous that this is the subject we're talking about. I spoke with my brother and sister-in-law a few hours ago who live in San Diego. And there, right now, they're having what we tend to want to call a once-in-a-100-year event. And as if it's something which is not going to happen again, and we'll excuse it and go away. And they're now living their 1-in-100-year event right now. And yes, it's not going to be that. You and I know that, don't we? And
it's very frightening, isn't it, Heather? And what was it, last week with the fires in Maui? It's
yes,
absolutely devastating, that we're so helplessly watching the news and seeing these beautiful places going up in flames, and we cannot bring them back. But this is
no.
a big you know. It just, I mean, even talking about it now gives me goosebumps. It makes my heart drop because it's absolutely devastating. I mean, there was a man opposite here where I live who was going to cut down one tree. He wanted to cut down the tree because it was making a mess on his car. And I became obsessed with this tree, this one tree. It was a beautiful tree. And I think the reason I became obsessed with it, I ended up calling up the council and getting it stopped. I was so obsessed with it. And I realized after, it's because of all the research I've done, this one tree, you know, one tree means so much. Imagine all of that. And not only that, but people losing their homes, their livelihoods, their lives, their loved ones. It's just beyond comprehension. I cannot. This is where we are now.
And look, you said that your research, I don't think that the word research is an appropriate word to use for you. You don't go and research your stories, you live them.
Yeah.
Your boots on the ground living. From Beekeeper of Aleppo, you know the stories because you go and live them. The research is something which is organic to you. You're absorbing it. And that plays out in your words and in your stories.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Heather. Gosh, no one's ever put it like that before. And it's, as soon as you said it, it really hit a nerve because I open myself, I go there open, you know, it's almost like open up all my pores. That's how I feel it. And I try and absorb as much as I can. I'm not even trying. I mean, it's difficult not when you're in a situation like that and hearing these kind of stories. So what I did for this is I went to Madi. It's a small town outside of Athens that experienced a very, very bad fire. And when I went to Madi, it was the same year as 2021. The fires were raging on the island of Evia. And I didn't go to Evia to interview anyone there because it was happening right there and then, like what you're saying about, you know, right there and then. I thought, I cannot speak to people that are going through it right now. It's too much. The idea had 3 years before that. So people were trying to recover from it. It was very difficult. And I met a lot of people in this cafe, which you'll see in the story. I mean, the story in an unnamed place in Greece because it could happen anywhere.
Exactly.
But I was inspired by this very beautiful cafe where survivors met and friendship, you know, and I'm always inspired by places like that. Like when I did my research, I'm sort of saying research again, but when I was volunteering, Women and Children Centre, I'm always going to have that in my mind now that you've said that, because it's such a good point, Heather. And so, you know, I just feel like there's these places that where there is devastation, there is also hope. And in the middle of working in Athens, when all those refugees were coming into Athens, that place of hope was the Women and Children Centre, where they drank tea and they did activities and there was a play area. And yes, people were traumatized and devastated, but they made friendships there. And it was the same with this cafe. So that's where I went to meet people, to speak to people. It was a safe place. It was a place where if people wanted to talk, they could. And if they didn't, and I've also found that people sometimes told stories without talking. Just
exactly.
The look on their face, and so I was surrounded by this. And then this man took me around and he said, I want to show you what existed before and what exists now. I want to describe to you what was there before and what was there now. And that was a very, very sad experience.
Yes. He would have been describing it to you full of trauma and memory and grief for what is gone. And with the people who have lived that, which you are now absorbing into you, there's nothing make-believe about it. It's real, it's raw. And listen, folks, that the cafe in your story, where you have the separate people that come, as you say, to their safe place, and they're in their little groups that they gather, or singly, the gentleman with the sister that pays him a visit, and beautifully introduce the same people into the story, thread it throughout, just sitting in the cafe and the reason they're there. And of course, the hidden story that is behind the owner of the cafe that plays out in the story.
Yeah.
Look, I have not attempted to say the names of your characters for one very good reason, folks. I am absolutely hopeless with accents. And I listened to you say them at the very beginning. I threw you that line to do that. And as soon as you did that, I said to myself, no, I'm not going to go there. I will butcher any attempt to say these beautiful names.
So yeah, well, one of the women that's at the cafe is Mrs. Gadagi. Gadagi, it's spelled with a G. It should sound like Gadagi, but it's Gadagi in Greek, which means little cat.
Right.
Or little cat, but it's not necessarily a kitten. It's a little cat, and so she brings something to the story. And you know, if we so there's this whole thing about trauma that you know, where you're saying I lived it, I spoke to people, I try to envision and understand, and you know, and the other thing was that so many people had scars, and so many people died in that fire as well, because it was managed. People was told to stay put, and they shouldn't have been told to stay put. And there were so many problems with how it was managed, with the funding of the fire brigade. There's so many issues. The people that I met wanted to take the fire brigade, the police, the government to court, and they did. And they have the right to. However, a bigger issue, the issue of global warming, the issue of there was a man who started the fire. They blamed him. They blamed the police. They blamed the fire brigade. They blamed the government. And this was all justifiable. But there was also, why did the fire get so big? People have been starting fires for years. The size, the dimension, the ferocity, the way that it burnt through this dry forest because the land hadn't been saturated enough. And when I ever mentioned anything to do with global warming, it was shut down immediately. And in a way, Mrs. Radagi in the story represents that side of us that cannot deal with, and I can relate to this because I kept putting myself in this situation. What if I'd lost my home? What if I lost a loved one? What if I lost my livelihood and everything I've ever known? I want to blame something tangible because it's easier that way, and because those things also need to be blamed because they are also. But it was sort of like every part of the blame was going there, and this ghost of climate change was hovering. It was like the massive ghostly elephant in the room that no one wanted to mention or talk about. And so some of the characters in the story represent that difficulty with facing something that's bigger than us, that we have all contributed to.
Well, not only contributed to, continue to ignore.
Yes.
I mean, yes. I live in Australia, as you know, and for me, well, we call them bushfires, and we're faced with them every summer. We're about to go into another bushfire season in the next few weeks. Already, we're hearing talks of the potential catastrophic nature that we're going to face, but because of those very same conditions that your fire was started in, that the very dry summer winters leading up to it, and not enough moisture in the ground. When the rains do come, it's just enough for the undergrowth. And then I read that the state where I used to live up until only a few months ago, because of financial reasons, have not gone and pre-ordered and booked the water bombing aircraft that they rely on every year. They're going to just cross their fingers because, we can't afford to have 10 this year, we're only getting 5. And it's just this blindness to the reality of allowing people to deforest. And Australia's, and I suspect that if you go back in countries like Greece too, where there's been perhaps a tradition of fires in the past, we have an Indigenous population here in Australia who know how to look after the land so that this doesn't happen. Do you think we listen to them? Of course not.
No, and the thing is, I don't know if it's, I'm sure it's the same in Australia. The controlled fires are really important in Greece.
Yes.
making controlled fires, and the people that work the land, they know all this, and they know how to take care of the land to clear the dried wood. The thing is, when I came back and I interviewed some climate scientists, one scientist said to me that even controlled fires, even people who really know the land and know how to sort of make a controlled fire, even they can't contain the fires anymore.
No, because the climatic conditions around it can change too quickly. It's become too unstable atmospherically as well.
Yeah.
So it's a double whammy. And that you've highlighted in this beautiful story, to me, is hopefully going to be something that readers will read, and hopefully then they will remember. And that's what you want your book to do, to be remembered, and the reasons why you wrote it.
Yeah, so I thought, because I've thought so many times that I think the first thing that we can all do is want to do something. You know, I think that means constantly being aware. So whatever it is, and my feeling is that you know, sometimes we watch the news and it's so overwhelming. I get overwhelmed and I switch off. I can feel myself, because it's too overwhelming. It's too much sort of crisis imagery. And I can sort of even feel my brain going a bit blank. But when I listen to one person's story or one family's story, that's when I connect. So what I urge people to do, not just with my book, but other stories, if there is a story to be heard, to be understood, to hear that story and really try and connect and empathize with what people are really, really going through, because it is happening now. So I think that's my desire, that we all start sort of really almost quietly really listening first, because I think we just get bombarded and then we shut off, and I can feel myself doing that. So when I say these things, I don't mean someone else will do it and not me, because I know I do it too. So I want to help myself in a way to be sort of consciously, constantly connected with what's happening. And I think from that, then different decisions are made naturally, I think.
I'm going to jump in here and just tell readers, Christy's book, folks, is not a smack you around the head. You have got to change the way you live. You have got to go and join your local climate change organisation. That is not what her book is about. That underpins the entire story. But it's this beautiful story, traumatic, loving, all the elements that you've already outlined. That is the story. What we're talking about here is the background. And I think I don't want us to now go down that whole path. I want you and I to talk about the beautiful story, which is what happens to people under these circumstances. Look, just leaving aside what happens to the forests, and oh my gosh, don't get me started on the flora and the fauna and the animal lives that get lost. That's again part of it. But just your beautiful weaving together of a story of a man and a woman and a little girl and the people around them. That is the beautiful story that you take. And once you get that story in your head, the reasons for you telling that story will become self-evident to readers, I'm sure.
Oh, thank you, Heather. Yeah, I mean, that came from just listening to people, you know, just hearing their stories and just absorbing it, and then creating a family, putting them there in this forest and thinking to myself, they've lost so much. How can they live now? What's going to happen to them? And you have Irini and you have Dasso, and Dasso is an artist, but he can no longer, because his hands have been burnt. He leaves. He makes a decision which haunts him. When the fire begins, instead of running down to the sea with Hara and Irini, he returns to find his father. I'm not going to say about that, but it does cause him to have this horrible injury on his hands. So he cannot paint. But even if he could paint, you realize as the story goes on that he wouldn't be able to anymore, because he completely broken. Now, when you read the story, I don't want to say too much, but Dasso loses his mum to cancer, because you go back into the past of how Irini and Dasso
Yes,
met.
you did it beautifully.
Because Irini initially lives in England and her dad's from Greece, and he takes her there every day and every summer, I mean, and she meets Dasso as a child and their childhood sweethearts. And anyway, so Dasso's mum dies of cancer when he's quite young. And I took this from my experience of watching my mum die from cancer. He develops this oversensitivity to the changes that are happening in his mother. You know, he wakes up and sees, is there something different about her? Is she dying more today? Is she closer to death? And so by doing that, he becomes this very sensitive boy. And he uses that same sensitivity when he's painting the beautiful forest. And when his dad is telling him, his dad works in the forest is changing. It's becoming higher, it's becoming. So he uses that same sensitivity to paint the forest. And he manages to create these beautiful pieces of art that, thank goodness, his dad keeps in his house. Most of them, some of them are burnt in the fire in dust when it's in his house, but some of them survive, and they are in the living room of Dasso's father's house. So you've got on the outside this burnt forest, and on the inside these paintings that still exist, that are so sort of vivid and vibrant and alive. And whoever walks into the house, sort of they re-experience the forest, but obviously it's not the real forest. And this family, that's the house they live in. And Hara has she has a scar on her back that looks like her mum describes to her as a tree. And this family are trying to heal, and they're trying to reconnect. And Irini so desperately wants her husband back because he's lost in his own world. And a lot of the story is about her desperately wanting to bring him back to her. And Hara too, she wants to play with her father. She wants to talk to him. She wants to, and all he can do is sit beneath a fig tree, a surviving tree in the garden. And it's a lot of the stories about how this daughter and this wife try and bring this man back to life emotionally.
And the daughter has got his sensitivity and his talent, and I love how that's been played out bit by bit through her. Beautiful interconnection there between father and daughter, and the people that you bring into the house, from the vet and the wife and the daughter and the other people who come in and immediately, of course, have driven through the burnt out forest to get to this house and now come into this room surrounded by living paintings. Folks, she just does an incredible job of visually taking you into her story, and the story of these three beautiful people. Brilliant work, love.
Heather. And I think this might be a good time to mention the Little Jackal, because
yes, I wondered if I should mention him.
I love animals, again, I've mentioned my mum before, but this came from my mum. She always used to feed, me and my brother used to call her Dr. Dolittle, because there were all these birds and foxes and things and everything that used to come and wait for her to feed them. And we'd look out the window and laugh because there'd be like a squirrel, and we'd be like, a squirrel was waiting for her, and a fox and birds and all sorts of things. We had a blackbird and a little robin. They were always together, and we called them Batman and Robin. Yeah, of course. So I think it comes from my mum, this sort of love for wildlife and animals, and she always used to say that she felt so sorry for animals because they cannot tell us with words their pain, but I think they do. And this jackal finds its way in the story to their house, and his paws are very badly burnt. And Hara, who is trying to recover from the trauma of this fire, this lovely girl, she takes him under her wing and helps him to heal. And the vet comes, and then I don't want to say too much, but there's a way of healing skin on animals by sewing fish scales onto them.
Fantastic thing that I learned about that. I'll never forget that now.
Yeah, so this little jackal becomes sort of, there's something about him that's almost like part mythical, because he has these silver fish scales. But I brought the jackal in because I wanted Hara to have she's I imagined her very weird, because I almost felt like I got really into writing these characters to the point where I just felt like I knew them. You know, I don't know if you feel that when you're writing, you sort of know them in a way, like they're your friends. And I thought with Hara that she has such a big heart that I wanted her to have someone else to help heal, or something else. And she helps this little jackal to heal, and actually he helps her too.
He helped her.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it.
I hope I'm not giving up. It's hard.
I think you're saying enough for everybody to want to go out there and grab that book and to get to know these beautiful characters you've created and feel the strong connection that you have with them. And that kind of brings me to the end note, the author's notes in your book. And I have them too. And sometimes I kind of want to argue with our respective publisher and say, can I put some of them up the front? Because it made perfect sense when you read your end notes that, of course, you were there. Of course, you lived the experience of getting the story, and giving away sort of end notes here, but I think we can, that you were pregnant with a little girl of your own.
Yeah.
But you then had that little girl in your arms while you were writing the story. And to be reading that all at the end is wonderful. But every now and then I don't wonder, is there some of this stuff we can throw in the front? We never do we? Because you can't have front notes, only end notes.
Yeah.
But when you talk about, I mean, where you put the information to tell the reader why and how you've written the story.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And I never thought about putting it in the front, actually, Heather. And that's such a good point. But then again, there's something lovely about allowing the reader to just sort of be with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And then reading the end notes when they're but then I suppose if I saw the notes at the beginning, I would decide, do I want to read them now or later, you know? So that's a really, really interesting point. With this one, I think what was different, because with all the other books that I've written, I wasn't pregnant, and being pregnant made the experience so different.
Of course it would.
It got to me so much more. And it wasn't, I mean, I was obviously, when you're pregnant, your hormones are all over the place, but it wasn't that. It was this feeling that this child that I was carrying was going to grow up in this world. So every story I heard, I was thinking about Evie and all the other little babies that were going to be born, and also the fact that I was there in Muddy while the fires were raging in Evia. And you know what I realized when I was pregnant, I had this weird response. I got afraid of being alone when I was pregnant, which I've never had that fear before. I became more sensitive and fearful of my environment, where there are dangers. I realize now, looking back, is that just vanished as soon as I had the baby. I realized it's overprotectiveness. You're not just looking after yourself, you're looking after the little being that's growing inside you. So it's almost like becoming suddenly very hyper vigilant. So knowing those fires were taking place not too far, I found horrendously, absolutely terrifying in a way I find even so difficult to explain or describe. And I think going there but while I was pregnant, even though it was so frightening, I'm glad I did it during that time, because it allowed me to absorb things differently and to really feel things that maybe I wouldn't have felt as strongly if I wasn't pregnant. And when Evie was born, I was absolutely knackered, as you can imagine.
Yep.
There was some time I couldn't start writing immediately because I was too tired and I had a cesarean, and you know, but there were these times where she'd fall asleep, and although I was tired, there was something she would do during the day. Like I'd be carrying her and she'd look up at the sky and I'd see sort of the colors of the sky in her eyes or something. And I wrote that down, and as she slept, I wrote down little snippets of things, little paragraphs. It's all I could manage. And if you read the story, you know those bits where Irini remembers little Hara when she was born.
Yes, yes, that was you.
That was me and Evie. And, you know, at that time, I was living in Walthamstow, and there is a forest in Walthamstow called Epping Forest, which is very beautiful. And I'd go for walks with Evie when she was very little in the forest. And I would just see her sort of absorbing things and taking things in. And then those little moments I had with her, I tried to sort of capture them and write them down. There were little things like that. And it's Hara, Irini remembers walking in the forest with Hara when she's born. And that the forest that's lost isn't just, it's a beautiful forest with ancient trees and animals and creatures and birds and all sorts of things. But it also holds her memories of her being with her husband before they got married and when they first got married, and her being with her baby daughter when she was little, and her having conversations with her father-in-law, and her visiting the same forest with her father when she was a little girl before he died. So the forest is also full of memories for her.
It's her home. It's her home.
Yeah, so I used that a little bit. I just thought I have these very special moments with Evie. If some of them stay in my mind, then I just sort of jotted them down and then I used them in the story.
And now they're recorded for all time.
Yeah.
She will read about them when she's older, and you will tell her, it is thanks to you that I wrote those sentences. It's thanks to you and my watching and marveling at you in that environment that enabled me to tell these bits of the story, these vignettes.
And I've dedicated the book to her. It's
Yes.
for Evie. And it's funny because she picks up the book and I've said to her, and I didn't say anything. She sort of opened it. She's 19 months. She opened it and looked at the picture at the back, which, by the way, I don't look anything like that anymore. But anyway, she recognized me and she went, Mama.
Yes.
Mama. In such a curious way. Because normally, you know, we open books and there's like a badger or a rabbit or something.
Or a gruffalo jumping out at you.
Exactly. So she, Mama. It was really sweet. So yeah, the book is dedicated to her. And the end note, you know, we were talking about the end note, I think is important in explaining something about the context, where I was when I went to Muddy, and you know, why being pregnant had such an effect on me. And you know, so I think the end notes are important. But yeah, I hear your point. Maybe they should be at the beginning. I mean, you know,
two of them, one or two of them.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll find the appropriate person to have that conversation with next to her in the publisher's office. Advance folks. I'm coming there very shortly. But yeah, for example, with the Tattooist of Auschwitz, when that first came out, I wanted to tell people when I was giving talks about it, one of the first things I found myself saying was that, listen, folks, it has a happy ending. I just felt the need to tell people up front, if they were going to think about reading this book from this very, very dark period of history, that it had a happy ending. So that's where I sometimes come from when I want to be able to say something up front. Can I please have an epilogue up front? Just a couple of pages.
I totally get that.
But getting back to the whole Evie thing and the impact her being pregnant and then her being a small baby had when you were writing, and I'm sure this just gets stronger and stronger, the feeling you have today about, well, this is the world that I've brought you into. And I have to do something. I can't be silent. And I've written a book, and now I'm going to get out and tell the world about my book so that you can learn, because I know that fear. Okay, they're not my children. Well, they are my children. They're big and ugly enough to look after themselves. But I have 5 little people in my life for whom I despair and for whom I want to apologize to. When you have a 6-year-old say something about the situation with the climate, and I go, and honey, I didn't do enough when I could have and I should have. For you now, to be worrying about it.
I know, it just makes me want to cry. It's so sad.
Yes.
It's so sad. But I think, you know, the way this idea of the happy endings that you're talking about, because the story I've written in a way ends on a hopeful note. I don't want to say too much, but I guess I'm an optimist, and I think it's not too late. And
Oh,
we
me
are,
too. Yes.
and as human beings, we have so much love and creativity, and we are so capable of repair. And I just feel that maybe if we just did something right now, that maybe we could, that maybe things could be different. I don't know. I mean, such a difficult subject, isn't it? But we, you know, I think,
It's something which it's so easy to feel impotent about doing anything about as an
yeah,
individual
yeah,
because of the governments and the corporations that actually dictate the changes that are happening and the inability for you as an individual. But I've actually got beyond that. I do believe that one individual can make a difference. And there are some of them out there now doing it. We've got the very young and Greta, and the other end of the age gap in Jane Fonda, an actress in the US who I admire incredibly for the work that she's doing. And so, yeah, one individual can. And you, as an individual, have actually now done and started going down that path too. And look, we're all going to be very, very grateful for what you're now introducing through your stories. Just
oh,
a little
thank
bit
you.
get into people's psyche, get into their heads and get them thinking. And they're
Yeah,
going to do that by reading a
yeah.
beautiful story. So,
And
win-win,
I
guys.
think, yeah, and it goes back in a way to, thank you, Heather. That's a lovely thing to say. And I think it goes back to this idea of the power of storytelling,
Yes.
and hearing stories, and how stories can highlight things because they personalize things, and they put us into the shoes of this one family. It's like when I wrote The Beekeeper, and again there was all this crisis imagery on the news, and you just sort of can become so numb to it, but a story can really help us to sort of just stand in the shoes of people and feel what they are feeling. And I think storytelling, I've always felt this since I was a little girl, how powerful stories can be.
Utterly. And your story, while it takes place in a Greek island, unnamed, it could be just about in so many other countries. It's not unique. And that's the message, I think, that what's happening here in your story is happening in so many other countries. It's a matter of the time of the year, the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere, which one's going to get hit.
Yeah.
But they're going to get hit, folks. They're going to get hit.
Yeah.
It's not a
Yes.
matter of if, but just when.
Yes. And
Until
it's just getting worse and worse. So when I went to do my research, see, I'm calling it research every time I
That's
say it now.
okay.
I know, I'm glad that you've said that, because it's really helped me to think. Even, I think it's a really interesting point. But when I went to Muddy, I just didn't realize that I mean, looking back, that was 2 years ago when I went. And in those 2 years, the fires have got so much worse.
Yeah. Yeah. They're back this year. And where it used to be something that happened every maybe 5 or 10 years, it's now every year.
And it's the size of the fires, it's the ferocity of the fires, it's how much has been destroyed, it's how fast they're moving. Some people described to me that the fire was moving so fast, it was unbelievable. They described it as a running monster. This is how one man described it. And
to outrun it is virtually impossible. The advance, and this all comes back to the authorities in each individual country and area, that they do not have the kind of early warning signals, and that the people who are living in the environment cannot often get the kind of notice they need. I lived in a bushfire region in Victoria for 20 years. And every morning in summer, I drove down the mountain out of the forest I lived in and went to work. And if it was going to be a hot day, I took my dog and my cat and I left them down at the end of the mountain with the vet for the day.
Oh, Heather, yeah, I see. Yeah.
And if we got through the day, then I picked them up on my way home. And so, yes, living that fear for weeks and weeks and months every summer.
Yeah, so you understand that fear. It's part of
Very
your
much
life.
so.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and it played out 2 or 3 times for me. We did have the fires come through. Yeah, the fear of living at the end of a dead-end street, knowing there's only one way out, and gosh, is that the way that the fire's going to come? So I'm very sensitive to the story for that reason, because I have lived it.
I can,
in the middle of it, and also lived it being in Australia, and then seeing how much this country burns every summer.
Oh, that's very difficult to live.
Are we doing anything? We're doing bits, and individually, like you, I get involved where I can, and I think that's what your story is just saying, that the authorities will only ever do so much. You can't always rely on the authorities, those elected officials that we live in, to do the right thing by everybody. They have other vested interests going, that individually you can help the people in your story so that it doesn't happen again in the environment in which you live. Yeah, it's sort of really hard one, isn't it? You've written this beautiful novel, and you want people to love the story, and they will love the story, but you want them to get the message. And even if 1 in 100 then go and find out something more about what they can do and how these are caused, then you've succeeded. You've got a win-win.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. Because people can read, they can take what they feel they want to take from the story, but that element of it does exist, and it is there, and it's all about sort of creating discussions, raising awareness, doing something in a gentle way, putting information somewhere and saying it's there, you can look at it. It allows people the freedom to absorb what they can, to think, to discuss, and I think I'm like that as well. Because if you're bombarded with something, it can have the opposite effect.
It paralyzes you.
Exactly. And I feel, maybe it's because I was teaching for so many years. I felt that with children, that if you sort of overload them with, think about this, you must think about, it sort of has this opposite effect. But if you say, look, have a look at this, let's read this together, let's have a think, then that sort of opens something. So I think what I'm trying to say is, what I hope to do with my novel is open discussion, open people's minds. It's that idea of openness that I'm interested in.
Well, if you have contacts with your education department, this would be a perfect story to be on the school curriculum. Not only because of wonderful storytelling, but because it is so open to young people being able to explore and talk amongst themselves. There will be many, many different interpretations. And this is what will make this a great story and a great novel for young adults in the school curriculum to be discussing.
Well, I mean, if that happened, that would be amazing. I think, like with the Beekeeper, what happened was a lot of teachers read the book and then started choosing it. It wasn't on the curriculum, but I would get a lot of messages saying, I'm teaching the Beekeeper. Would you mind talking to our class? So I do little talks on Zoom. A lot of this happened, during the lockdown, when teachers were teaching on Zoom. And so I'd sort of join on Zoom and do like a little talk. And I found that a lot of teachers were teaching Beekeeper, even though it wasn't on the curriculum. So I really do hope that might happen with the Book of Fire as well. I would be delighted if that happened.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it will. Well, I think given that the time that is fastly coming up to the hour, that this could be an appropriate time to just sort of wrap up with that wish and that hope that the teachers, the schools, the education department will look at this story, this beautiful novel of yours, and see it as something which can be not only enjoyed by the children, the young adults, which I think it could be aimed at, but something that they can learn from. And I'm going to throw the last word over to you, Christy, before we thank Fane very much for allowing us this platform to have this chat tonight.
Well, I just want to say, Heather, it's such a pleasure talking to you. I love your questions. I love the way it sort of leads us to think, and we have these wonderful discussions. And thank you for your passion and for everything that you've said about the Book of Fire, because it's a story that's so close to my heart, and it means so much to me that you've given me this time and asked me these beautiful questions.
The Book of Fire, people. Go and find it. It'll be there everywhere, every bookshop that you walk past. Go and find it and read Christy's beautiful story. Thank you, Christy. It's been a delight, as always.
Thank you, Heather.